thanks to all of you for giving up an evening. I hope you will think it's time well spent, as Craig, who I thought I would leave to give my paper for a moment there, said it is a book that we've all got to do business with, I think. It is 35 years old, but it poses questions that I wish I'd had his help in addressing many years ago. It's extraordinary that this book was never recommended to me, except actually by Leslie Newbegin. I overheard him chatting about it, and it kind of stayed in my subconscious, amazingly. And I actually think it's the most important book I've ever read. So George Steiner, who died in Cambridge just 20 months ago, was a secular Jewish thinker and teacher whose sensitivity to Catholic Christianity inflects this magnificent essay. We must read him as much as we are able as Christians within the frame of the Holocaust, humbled by the courageous depth of his work into a civilization in which the Holocaust happened, ours, Christendom. I want in this paper to show how his own religious literacy enabled Steiner's devastating critique of postmodernism. Postmodernism may be defined as an intellectual movement that regards all truth claims as totalitarian. It was just taking off at the time Steiner gave this essay as a lecture in 1985. He was intent, it seems, on an immense and sometimes angry pushback against 100 years of deconstruction of Western civilization. For, as he says, deconstruction is not just a 20th century phenomenon. Religious literacy legitimately may, and I say should, therefore inform any reading of Steiner's oeuvre. Steiner used theological categories throughout his work without ever calling himself one. But all the while he was writing as a secular philosopher, journalist, and literary critic. His theological acuity prompts a legitimate question as to his own tacit, even unconscious conversion. It was at least a conversion of language, I contend, which to him was much more than a game. This is surely evidenced in the wealth of his Christian references and the conviction with which he wrote, which is unmistakable. His amazing sensitivity to the, in quotes, necessary possibility, as he puts it, of the creative logos, and he does here mean the Christian revelation, forms the keystone of real presences. By the end of the paper, I hope to have demonstrated this, the redemptive potential of this work. Steiner is attempting no less than a recovery of the possibility or the meaning of meaning. And he says meaningfulness is something we can have. It exists. It is religious. He says that on page 225. It exists in the pact of word and world. That pact means that reality exists, that it is enfleshed. It is both messianic and incarnational. But as Christian theologians, we must try to read Steiner's messianism as he writes it, always with a lowercase m. I am not qualified to understand the Jewish sense of messianism or its delay, and thereby lies the terrible vacuum, despite the pointers to hope that there are in this book, that ultimately confronts us as Christians in this brilliant work. First, then, a few biographical notes, just to situate this man. Francis George Steiner was born in Paris, France, on 23rd of April, 1929, and died in Cambridge, UK, on 30th of February last year. His father, a Viennese financier, saw the writing on the wall and moved the family from Vienna, first to France and then presciently to America, before the Second World War in 1940. Steiner's academic career was stratospheric and multilingual. He became Professor of English and Comparative Literature in the University of Geneva, Professor of Comparative Literature and Fellow in the University of Oxford in 1994, Professor of Poetry at Harvard University 2001, and he was the first Professor of Literature at the New Churchill College, Cambridge. He saw himself as belonging nowhere, but a guest of everywhere. It was an attitude he felt we all should embody. Gratitude, the gratitude of the guest. He was an avowed Jewish intellectual, but one who hated Zionism and poured scorn on the parochialism of little Israel, in inverted commas. He valued the enormity of Western civilization, yet abhorred the idea of nationhood to which it had given rise. To him, the nation prevented the necessary universal perspective and respect for norms. Yet, nationhood is a phenomenon that owes its existence largely to the possibilities of shared language, which printing made possible. And that was the gift of Christendom, and gave Steiner his eminence as an academic. Language was the very bedrock of the idea of the West, which so fascinated him. He reveled in the life of the mind, yet criticized those like Derrida, who obsessed over philosophy to the neglect of its art or the West's art or music. He was reviled and revered in equal measure. I have no doubt he stands in line with the great Hebrew prophets, whose radical critique of rulers and principalities was salvific, even if sacrificial. Real Presences is, for me, a most holy book of secular thought, up there with T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets, which in parts it strongly evokes and seems to be nurtured by. What is not so well known about Steiner is that he started as a journalist, to my amazement, spending 4 of the happiest years of his life, to quote, on The Economist in London from the age of 23. Also contributed more than 100 pieces to the New Yorker and Times Literary Supplement magazines that he never collected and republished. A great loss. Indeed, he was senior book reviewer at the New Yorker from 1966 until 1997. It is from a position of authority and with some irony, therefore, that he laments, in quotes, the genius of the age, close quotes, as being that of journalism. Journalism anesthetizes what its monotone of graphic urgency journalism anesthetizes with its monotone of graphic urgency, he complains. It articulates an epistemology and ethics of spurious temporality. He says, we are made whole again and expectant in time for the morning edition, sounding very Prufrockian. We have to bear this in mind as we consider his demolition of the so-called secondary city of scribblers, which is the title of the first of the 3 sections of the book. Real Presences started life as the Leslie Stephen Memorial Lecture given before the University of Cambridge on the 1st of November 1985 when he was 56. Leslie Stephen, interestingly, was one of the most famous agnostics of his day, having been an Anglican priest who renounced his orders and an essayist and the father of Virginia Woolf, as well as a fellow of Trinity Hall College, Cambridge. The crux of Steiner's masterpiece is that words are not any longer understood as describing the world, as I've said. And it is, and I quote, this break in the covenant between word and world, which constitutes one of the very few genuine revolutions of spirit in Western history, and which defines modernity itself. That's a quote. This is perhaps the greatest key in contemporary literature to understanding our present culture wars. And that's me saying that. As students of Leslie Newbigin, we know well that for our contemporary culture, there is no truth to be known. Only what is true for you. What we say is not meant to be borne out necessarily by what we do. Sexual ethics are a private matter for politicians, and so on. For Steiner, the full experience of created sense needs to be rediscovered, and along with it, our very ability to be human. What has been lost is nothing less than that wager on God without which meaning cannot be made, because meaning, like art, is predicated upon the expectation of response. All communication is answerable because God made himself answerable by creating humanity. But post-deconstruction, words can mean more or less anything we want them to mean. We have been orphaned by the absence of God. We have been rendered silent by the absence of God. Mark Krupnik, professor of religion and literature at University of Chicago Divinity School, notes that Steiner has been led close to the edge of a specifically Christian affirmation by the logic of his defense of old Europe. There is in it, he says, a kind of incarnationist aesthetic. The book's title, after all, deliberately evokes the medieval church and its affirmation of the real presence of Christ's body and blood in the wafer and wine of the Eucharist. And the book's cover is George de la Tour's Christ in the carpenter shop, holding a light to his Father's work. Steiner's oeuvre concerns the status of language and the humanities in the wake of the most bestial of all centuries. There is precious little overtly about this bestiality in Real Presences, and amazingly, almost nothing specific about the Holocaust. It doesn't need to be there. It is the vast shadow around the very act of thinking in which the small light of hope has gone out. Instead, its focus is on the Jewish diaspora and what Steiner calls the strange fruit of its perpetual deferral of Messianism. It is perhaps not surprising to find that his Jewish interlocutors either ignore the book in their interviews with him or concentrate merely on the Holocaust dimension of it. But Steiner was heroically going behind the Holocaust in his search for the creative rather than the destructive force of old Europe. There are but two epochs for Steiner, that of the epoch extending from the pre-Socratic to the later 19th century, as constituted by the saying of being, or realism, in other words. The real is sayable. What is there can be expressed. From then on, however, we are living post-theologically, losing our moorings in the vast sweep of the civilizational story, where all previous study was predicated upon its forebears, but lost now with the death of God, Nietzsche's expression, where we now live after the word. For Steiner, deconstruction began at the end of the 19th century. Roger Scruton defines deconstruction as the attempt to, I quote, mount a comprehensive critique of Western culture and to propose a method for studying the products of that culture, which will neutralize their claim to authority. It tries to abolish logocentrism. And what is that? Logocentrism means being is sayable. Speech acts because the word created the world. The great Johannine enunciation of this truth at the beginning of his gospel is the almost unfathomable insight that God created the world through the Word who became flesh and lived our life with us. Deconstruction seeks to abolish the speaker of the word, privileging, as oddly does Islam also, the written word or text alone. As such, it is Christian-hating, audacious, and to Steiner, absurd. The very word person, which is something I didn't know, and I should have done, is derived from the Latin per sonare, the one through whom speaking is sounded. Simon Waitman, head of religious studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies, used often to note that the idea of embodiment in our society is often derailed by a fetish for representation. We embody the word sounding through us as persons. It is intriguing for a journalist that Steiner says the saying and not the reading or the writing of being. To get a sense of the import of this is to get the tiniest glimpse of what we lost at the Gutenberg Revolution. For American media guru Marshall McLuhan, who said, "The world is a global village and the medium is the message," the printed word made scribbling hermits of us all. It created Protestantism and all its sects, even destroyed our ability to make community together. For Steiner, who championed McLuhan, the scribblers are the secondary city, parasitic on the primacy of true art. McLuhan and Steiner throw interesting light on one another's deeply felt religious passion for the same thing, the power of the word, but coming from different orientations. There is far more in the book than can be said in any critique of it, and I hope I haven't lost you already. But it practices what it preaches, which is to build upon as much of what has gone before as can be encompassed. Its cultural references are so vast and so dense and mutually reinforcing that any reading necessarily bears out merely the predilections of its readers. But that's the point. Like living scripture, it seems personal, different with each reading, its many-layered depths consonant with the maturity of the reader, and with whatever is preoccupying one at any given moment. I have never defaced any book quite so frantically as this, in case in my unsuspecting naivety I missed anything. Steiner's opening premise is unambiguous, however. Our culture has gone wrong. The enigma of creation, as he put it, has been lost. We have buried God in verbiage. The primary city of creativity as a direct response to the givenness of creation has been submerged in a secondary city of useless critique and punditry, and journalists are one of the prime culprits. Art is a critical act, in itself a critical act, a response to life. It is inspired as opposed to discursive, however. That there was always scholarly comment and interpretative discourse from the classical era onwards is true, but for Steiner, to take just one of 1,000 possible examples, the close referencing, for instance, in Dante's Purgatorio of the Aeneid tells of the felt limits of the classical in regard to Christian revelation, and he says that, and builds on it, not merely rejecting it. By comparison, there is no critical academic equivalent, he says. The modern phenomenon, what Blake called the dark satanic mills of the university system, grinding out its hopeless anti-Christianity, is what it is, since it parts company with tradition, continuity, and above all, theology, once known as the queen of the sciences. It is not part of the grand narrative in which all may share depending on their level of education. It feeds promiscuously and voraciously upon its own contemporaneity without discrimination, even as it peddles its feeble wares in the name of democracy. It is above all American, says Steiner. It is not part of that answering form that energizes into creative responsibility. There is almost no sense of answering to anything precedent that characterizes true scholarship. Steiner helps us see we live at a time of cultural deprivation, of epochal time wasting, with barely any time for access to the primary, dependent as we are upon the approval of the second-rate gatekeepers of material success. Americanization for Steiner is constituted by two things: immanence, and egalitarianism. Both result ineluctably in contempt and blindness for what has gone before. There is no strategy of exclusion. How could there be? No canonical sense. The past matters to America, says Steiner, in direct reference to its usability in and by the present. In support of this withering indictment, we might notice how Facebook, which now impacts the emotional as well as business lives of a third of the world's population, and that's a statistic I picked up from the Telegraph, so it must be true. Facebook purports to be enhancing our relations, our lived response to life itself, but is in fact feeding off it, driven by advertising. It harvests the data of our lives for profit. It is the same parasitism masquerading as light that McLuhan laments as Luciferan in electronic communications. Electric communications ape the unifying, embodying work of the Holy Spirit, says McLuhan. There are two reasons for the grey morass of secondary literature, this secondary city. One, the professionalization of the academic pursuit and appropriation of the liberal arts, which means jobs for everyone. And two, the humanistic imitation of the scientific, which has a lot to do with the university funding cycle and the need for self-justification that can be tabulated and quantified. He lambasts the whole university experience. No wonder he was so loathed in the senior common rooms of Cambridge, according to one of my sources. He accuses his Donish colleagues of a craven need for remission from direct encounter with the real presence. We welcome those who can domesticate, who can secularize the mystery and summons of creation, he writes at page 39, while enjoying a fabulous career in the academy himself. This is writing with the force of Old Testament prophecy, and like the prophets, Steiner directs his ire first at his own. The Talmudic method, the habit formed of the vast exegesis of Jewish law and legend that replaced temple worship, set the pattern even for our times. Replacing temple worship, that is after the destruction of the temple, after the death of Christ. Gentiles must tread with care here, but not blindfolded, I trust, for this is the nub of the book and it is holy ground. Says Steiner, the identity requirements of the Jewish dispersion and the tragedy of the messianic delay question the very concepts of meaning, because it queries the possibility of any significant relations between word and world. What he criticizes as hermeneutic unendingness in postmodernism draws its method from three moments in history, which I will take in turn. First is Talmudic exegesis, as I've said. In dispersion, he says the text is homeland. The text is homeland. This reading without end of the Talmudic method represents the foremost guarantee of Jewish identity, he says. The Mosaic prohibition against images, the, in quotes, immemorial Jewish diffidence in the face of the act of creation, renders so much scholarship mere commentary rather than a shaping of aesthetic form. The second historical moment at which the relations between the primary and secondary are argued in depth, he says, is medieval scholasticism, which also threatened obsessive unendingness. Taking the text and picking it apart with endless referencing. But succeeding popes put an end to that with bulls invoked to insist on finality. The reason finality was possible for scholasticism was, says Steiner, that there is a strict, utterly mysterious temporality in the coming and ministry of Christ. It's absolutely extraordinary that he can say these things, but as we see later, disavow them. There is a strict, utterly mysterious temporality in the coming and ministry of Christ, which puts an end to the unendingness of scholasticism. Christ came in actual time and in an actual place that are known. For Steiner, that crucially stabilizes eternity. He says, the alternative is satanic chaos, he says. This is a terribly strong rebuke against America in particular, to its secularizing exegetes, and to Derrida in particular. Steiner had huge respect for Jacques Derrida, but dismissed deconstructionism in his Edinburgh Festival 50th anniversary lecture as jugglers' ingenuities. It is now barely possible to say anything with auctoritas or finality, to mean anything at all. If Christ does not live, neither can we be rid of the chaos and evil of unendingness. It is at this point that Steiner seems to be echoing McLuhan, who lamented the print revolution for fragmenting what the church had fought so hard to unify. Accessible printed texts made and continue to make heresy possible. They made silent reading at high speed possible. McLuhan says there wasn't any before Gutenberg. Before, the text was not read by all, but heard by all, moderated by the speaker's personhood, enfleshed in his life, his example, his voice, his inflection. Steiner says something similar. The Roman Catholic warning that interpretation without end will modulate first into historical criticism, next into more or less metaphoric deism, and lastly into agnosticism, is logically and historically valid. Where it is without finiteness, secondary discourse is schismatic. For McLuhan, print creates sects, which is his dismissive term for all non-Catholic Christian religion. He says, acoustic or tribal man reacts like a deviant or Protestant, a rebel when he opposes the centralized bureaucracies and legalistic hierarchies which we inherited from the alphabet. Reading made Protestants of us all, even though the gospel was given in a literate age and broke up the church. There is a third moment of self-conscious awareness of the importance of the relations between the primary and the secondary. And this is forms the end of section 1 for Steiner. And it is psychoanalysis and the application of Freudian methodology to art and literary criticism. And here we are back among the diaspora. There is no known way of putting a stop to the endless connections being made by the patient and his memory, or the secularized literary critic and her text, or, as Steiner amusingly puts it, the buried intentionalities and self-betrayals of the musical composition. The archaeology of sense is as vertical, it is as much directed towards the de profundis as is that of Talmudic exegesis, from which so much of the spirit of Freud's hermeneutics was derived, says Steiner. And so to section 2, the broken contract. Both Steiner and McLuhan fixed on the power and religious modalities of speech and text as the locus of power to enlighten, unify, or destroy. Steiner now sets out to falsify deconstructionism with a welter of evidence from his elite reading of the Western canon. It is obvious that words can or can be made to do anything. Human beings have the utter freedom and the privacy to say anything at all, whether it means anything or not. But it is also obvious that fact does not affect the truth. Truth and beauty are quite clearly not dependent upon mass education or democratization of taste or proliferation of accessibility. Paradoxically, the reverse is the case. Certainly there are inadmissible propositions that can be said, that Mozart was tone deaf, for instance, which nonetheless have no bearing on verifiability. So Steiner makes short work of semiotics, where words are deemed to shift in meaning, deemed not to carry any responsible freight other than what the speaker intends or the hearer understands, referring merely to other words in a kind of endless, meaningless loop. I remember my supervisor loftily wafting through a party one night at psoas and just saying, all is discourse. I mean, that was the mantra of the age. This notion that words can mean anything you want them to mean resulted for a while in the UK in third way thinking during the Blair era, where a thing was so just because you said it was so, or by appeal to numbers. The fact is that over time, as Steiner says, the canon is forged and perpetuated by the few. Steiner is saying that there is an inherent authority in the truth, as expressed in fine art, music, or classical literature, which comes to govern the way we live in our bodies. He says, our codes of literate exchange, of inferred recognition, are pervaded, as is educated parlance itself, by the august implication and presence of the classic. This is beautifully expressed in the following sentence: Vermeer's treatments of fabric have schooled our fingertips. It is the same point he makes about ingestion in the first section of the book. Texts memorized generate a shaping reciprocity between ourselves and that which the heart knows. The word and the body are vitally, incarnationally reciprocating. Oh, would modern educations understand the soul-saving power of learning poetry by heart. Steiner now sets his sights ever more sharply on the ploys of language theorists whose various stratagems deplete the mysterious power of the word by applying to it various reductionist ideas borrowed from science or from gaming. But none of these proposals persuades, he says, and I'm not going to go into them now. No interpretative method has bridged the gap between linguistic analysis and linguistic theory, properly defined on the one hand, and the process of understanding on the other, says Steiner. He does not begrudge the effort made, however. Steiner may be irascible and even contemptuous, but he relishes the intellectualizing of a good argument. As he says in his interview with Law Adler, for me to be a Jew means to be trying every morning to be someone who learns something new. For me to be a Jew is to remain a student, to be someone who learns. It is to reject superstition, the irrational. It is to refuse to turn to astrologers to find out your destiny. It's to have an intellectual, moral, spiritual vision. And this maybe explains the energy in the book, an essay that does not shirk the effort to compass the semantic potential of innovation and inexhaustibility, which does exist, but that's not the same as unendingness. His appreciation of the gift that art and literature, and above all music, are, the effort in his straining towards semantic possibility, is something he takes personally, as if he alone must strain to mend it or die of a broken heart. I found myself moved to tears several times in this book. So in section 1, Steiner sets out the problem that truth is no longer sayable, and too much of the intellectual ferment of our culture is a participation in truth's destruction. In section 2, we looked at who has created the problem and how successful or not are their strategies. Steiner shows how shallow, brittle, deceptive, and deadly are these strategies. Section 3 sets out to mend what has been broken, to recover meaning even as hope is delayed. And here, Steiner is at his most overtly theological. The section begins assertively, retrieving categories, pronouncing judgment on the arrogant, cowardly pretension of the masters of the academy. There is, after all, he says, language, there is art, because there is the other, page 137. And who is this other? Ultimately, it is none other than the Messiah. Again, that elliptical lowercase m. For in the Messianic dispensation, every semantic motion and marker would become perfectly intelligible truth. It would have the life-naming, life-giving authority of great art when it reaches the one for whom it is uniquely intended. And he fleshes the notion by saying, for instance, our cities are different after Balzac and Dickens. History then, and all classical art, is the history of meaning. All the more shattering then, and I'm moving now to towards my conclusion. All the more shattering then to find at the end of the book a pulling back from the force of his own intuited conclusions, just the whisper of modish relativism that almost makes one gasp. There is pure doxology throughout this final section, quotation after quotation of praise from Dante, D.H. Lawrence, Yeats, Eliot, which transcend annihilation. Citations he juxtaposes with the banalities of atheist philosophers like Bertrand Russell, whom he accuses of being metaphysically tone deaf. And then the greatest banality and betrayal of all being his own, as if in his own historic loyalties, he cannot betray the very lostness he has seemed so magnificently to invoke. He writes, "What I affirm is the intuition that where God's presence is no longer a tenable supposition, and where his absence is no longer a felt, indeed overwhelming weight, certain dimensions of thought and creativity are no longer attainable, surely prophetic and true." But then he adds, "No man can read fully, can answer answeringly to the aesthetic, whose nerve and blood are at peace in skeptical rationality, are now at home in immanence and verification. We must read as if." That is the best that can be hoped, as educated opinion has entered upon the new freedom of a scientific, secular world, and freedom is clearly ironic here. And even with that, as if God existed, all that is left may be religious fundamentalism and kitsch. It is that insidious two-letter word, we, that makes me worry. Has Steiner, after all, capitulated to the zeitgeist? It is problematic. The hope of Easter Sunday that he acknowledges on the very last page is, in quotes, analogous. Non-believers must continue to wait in an endless Saturday of suffering, aloneness, unutterable waste on the one hand, and the dream of liberation, of rebirth on the other. Having built his essay upon the Christian categories of meaning, he dispenses with the Sunday of resurrection as, in quotes, a dream, a utopia, where presumably the aesthetic will no longer have logic or necessity. This is a bizarre refusal of all that has energized the writing of this lecture or essay, all that has been said. Certainly the lineaments of that Sunday, he says, carry the name of hope. There is no word less deconstructible. But he has deconstructed it. And he even mimics and inverts T.S. Eliot, the greatest of Christian poets of the century in question, in his final flourish. And you may pick me up on this, but I studied Eliot all my life, and I'm very sensitive to his tone. Where Eliot in Little Gidding, and I lived in Little Gidding for a year, where he writes his famous paean of hope, "All shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, when the tongues of flame are enfolded into the crowned knot of fire, and the fire and the rose are one." Steiner implies that the fire is the Holocaust. He writes in the same prophetic tone, "The apprehensions and figurations in the play of metaphysical imagining, in the poem and the music, which tell of pain and of hope, of the flesh which is said to taste of ash, and of the spirit which is said to have the savor of fire, are always Sabbatarian." Is Steiner just as much a eunuch, his word for the critic, a creature of the secondary city, as any of those whom he despises? Isn't he, after all, tragically and willfully dependent upon the Logos, on the language and intuitions that produced all that he so lauds in the long continuities of Western civilization, and that have been laid so tragically to waste by the nihilistic thinking he excoriates? He says, politically, morally, perhaps little, very little in this 20th century, one of the cruelest, most wasteful of hope in human record, gives motive for anything but a lucid forgetting about God, he writes. And so I conclude, real presences presents us with the very thing Steiner denies as a possibility, an unanswerable question. And that question is, why has the Messiah not come? It is too terrible even to think. We must read real presences with religious literacy to confront the truth as it embraces us all, truth both terrible and beautiful and ultimate. We cannot, after all, end the unending, or can we? Has Steiner tried to square the circle, have his cake and eat it, bear witness to a civilization built on a hope he intuits but denies? Is hope even possible? Steiner's courage in writing this book does not seem to offer more than an ambivalent eschatology, but in the end we must choose. As Christians, I believe the following questions must be addressed as a matter of the greatest seriousness, a word Steiner emphasized. What is the contemporary salience of the Logos for our mission to postmodernism? Can meaning be recovered only as if God existed? What is the significance for postmoderns of the Christian theology of the relationship of speech and text? Does Steiner throw light on this? Can Christians ever really legitimately address the meaning of this book? Where is hope for Steiner? Thank you.